Okay, colleagues, I think we're ready to get going here with this program. And it's my pleasure to welcome especially all of the people who are joining us online for this Wilson Center event today entitled Driven Out, Global Response to the Plight of Forcibly Displaced People. And the program is hosted by the Refugee and Forced Displacement Initiative, which goes by the initials RAFDI. I'm sure many of you probably don't know who I am, but my name is Jim Hollifield, and I am a professor and director of the Tower Center at SMU in Dallas, and delighted to have a group of colleagues who have come together here today for this program. Normally, the introduction would be done by Jonathan Majok, who is a colleague here at the Wilson Center. I should have mentioned I'm also a global fellow at the Wilson Center and been a public policy scholar here on and off. So been affiliated with the Wilson Center for over 20 years. A fantastic place to work, I might add. But Jonathan is, his wife is in labor giving birth to their fourth child today, so obviously he's with her, so he cannot be here. So I'm just going to quickly run through a few introductory comments about the program and the Wilson Center, and then I will turn it over to my colleague Rina Agarwala. I'll introduce her in just a moment. So here we go. More than 55 years ago, the United States Congress established the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars as a living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, who was and still is the only president with a PhD, who had a PhD in political science, I might add. I'm a political scientist. And I think he was the third president of the American Political Science Association. But as a congressionally chartered think tank, the Wilson Center provides nonpartisan counsel and insights on global affairs to policymakers through deep research, impartial analysis, open dialogue, and independent scholarship. And the Wilson Center is a bridge between the world of academia and the world of public policy. The Refugee and before I talk more about RAFDI, I just want to thank the President, Ambassador Mark Green, for being part of this program and for hosting us, and also my colleague, Dr. Rob Litvak, who is head of the Fellows Program here, Vice President of the Center. So the RAFDI program provides evidence-based analysis that translate research findings into practice and policy. It was established in response to an ever-increasing number of people forcibly displaced from their homes by conflicts, persecution, and other factors. RAFDI aims to expand the space for new perspectives, constructive dialogue, and sustainable solutions to inform policies that will improve the future of these displaced people. And with human displacement numbers at a historic high and limited opportunities for voluntary return, I think we're going to hear more about this from our panelists shortly, restricted host country environments for refugee integration, and few places for refugee resettlement, the need for sustainable solutions and innovative ways to support both the displaced people and the host countries has never been greater and more urgent. You know, as someone who has worked at different points in my career for UNHCR, for example, I know many of you are familiar with UNHCR, which is, I describe it sometimes like the International Fire Brigade that has to come in and really take care of people who have no other way of surviving, were it not for the help of the international community. And I would invite you to have a look at the RAFDI website. We've got a number of important articles and papers that are already on the website, lots of policy briefs that are there. So I would invite you to look at the RAFDI site and learn more about this key issue. I think we're up to like 110 million people now in the world who are people of concern to UNHCR. So those numbers have been growing very systematically over the past decade or so. So today our panelists will discuss the dynamics of human displacement and how the global system addresses the plight of people driven out of their homes by a confluence of factors. That title, by the way, comes from an article that I published in the Wilson Quarterly a couple of years ago. So again, you can see at least my thoughts on this by looking at the article. Our speakers will highlight the challenges, but also the opportunities that forced displacement presents for the forcibly displaced people and states that host them across the globe. So thank you again for joining us, especially all of you who are out there online and those of you who are here in person. And I want to thank my colleagues who've joined this program. And now I want to turn the program over to a colleague who teaches at Johns Hopkins University. This is Professor Rina Agarwala, who is relatively new to our little group here. She is the author of a number of prize-winning books, most of them focused on India, one called Informal Labor with Cambridge University Press. I met her about a year ago at a meeting in Chicago. She had just published another prize-winning book called The Migration Development Regime, an intriguing title by Oxford University Press. And she's got another book, which has got another interesting title, Whatever Happened to Social Class, published by Routledge. So, and she's been at Johns Hopkins, I think, for a number of years. I mentioned meeting her last year in Chicago. I just want to thank those, especially those who are joining us online. We are here for the Social Science History Conference, which is taking place starting tomorrow here in Washington, D.C., and that is where I met Professor Agarwala last year in Chicago. So with that, I think I will now turn it over to my colleague, Professor Agarwala, who will introduce the panelists, and she will moderate and chair the session. Rina, it's yours.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jim, and it's an honor to be moderating this panel of very distinguished speakers and scholars. I myself have always sort of identified as a scholar of migration and not of refugees, as though those two things are very separate. So I'm particularly interested in hearing from these speakers today. What are the forces that create forced displacement? Could it include economic forces such as hunger, thirst, unemployment, or do we have a sort of distinction between political and social versus economic? So I just thought I'm going to introduce everyone now so that we can just run through the program. And we're going to begin with Professor David Scott Fitzgerald, the co-chair of the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies and professor of sociology at University of California, San Diego. He's also the author of a beautiful new book called The Refugee System. And he's going to start off our discussion by sort of setting the stage by going through the actual systemic nature of this topic that we're going to get into today. Then we're going to turn over to Professor Peter Bevelander. He's the director of the Malmö Institute of Studies of Migration, Diversity, and Welfare at Malmö University in Sweden. He's going to take us over to the receiving country context, especially in Europe. We'll then go over to Gerasimos Sourapas, professor of international relations at University of Glasgow, and he will then take us into receiving and sending countries in Middle East, especially North Africa. And then we'll turn to Kamal Sadiq. We'll return to California in some ways. He's the director of the Center for Global Peace and Conflict Studies at UC Irvine, and he will bring us to understanding the sending and receiving countries of the Global South. And then we will end with Professor James Hollifield, who really is sort of the father of migration studies, especially in political science, also the co-chair of RAFDI, as he mentioned, and a professor and director of the Tower Center at Southern Methodist University in Texas, and he's going to give us some comments to wrap up our discussion. So thank you. Over to David Fitzgerald.
Thanks very much. And, I'd like to start just picking up on something you said about how refugees and migrants are completely different. We look at the sign on the screen that says RAFDI, right? The refugee and forced displacement. Immediately, we have to ask, are refugees a subset of people who've been forcibly displaced? Are they different? Are refugees migrants? And there is a large literature, a large debate about the very basic categories that we use to talk about these things. It's a complex issue. And most of this debate is really quite siloed, where all of us have specific bodies of knowledge that we're engaging. There's a whole academic field of refugee studies, which doesn't really start growing as a field until the 1980s. And historically, it's been pretty separate from the study of international migration, which has primarily been concerned with labor migration and hasn't necessarily paid that much theoretical attention to people who have been forced to move because of violence or persecution. And then you have conflict studies, which is really only interested in what's happening in places of conflict, forgets about refugees unless they continue to be involved in the conflict in some way or might be involved in post-conflict reconstruction. So you have these academic silos of knowledge around these issues. The UN is also organized in ways that contributed to this siloization. Recently, we've been reminded that even among recognized refugees, that Palestine refugees, Palestinians, are under the mandate of UNRWA, as opposed to the rest of the world's refugees under UNHCR, or the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, only deals with refugees when it comes to very specific issues around the logistics of refugee resettlement or repatriation, but has a giant portfolio when it comes to other forms of migration. In the law, we see silos around refugee law as opposed to immigration law and humanitarian law, even though at particular moments it would be really important to understand the interactions in these bodies of law. So I think that there's a lot to be learned, even if we can understand why there are different bodies of knowledge. There's a lot to be learned by looking at these intersections. And that's what we're trying to do with a systems approach to the study of forced migration and displacement. A systems approach really focuses on interactions and sequences of feedback loops that involve people and states, both in places of origin and transit and in destination. So one of my charges today is to help us think through issues on the southern border of the US, and just to give you an illustration of how a systems approach would look at something like Salvadoran migration to the US. The Salvadoran economy for many, many decades was highly dependent on the US, but it wasn't until the Civil War started there in 1979 that we see large-scale Salvadoran migration to the US. So over the course of that Civil War, the Salvadoran population grew from only 94,000 in the US to 465,000 as the interventions of a core state in the world system, the United States, into a peripheral state, El Salvador, generated movement in the opposite direction, back to the US. But that's not the end of the story. Only about 2.6% of Salvadoran asylum applicants during that period were granted asylum. That was a time when US asylum policy overwhelmingly only granted asylum or some kind of refugee resettlement to people who had left communist countries rather than US client states. Since then, we've seen that originally forced migration has generated all other kinds of migrations, of family reunification, of more labor migrations, of mixed flows, which I'll talk about in a moment. And we see other kinds of feedback loops where gang members who formed in places like Los Angeles and Houston in the US were forcibly sent back to El Salvador in the form of deportation. And then that generated a lot of criminal activity in El Salvador, which itself spawns new migrations to the US. The core state of the US is also reaching into more peripheral states like Mexico to try to use them as a buffer to prevent Salvadorans and others from transiting Mexico to the US. So this is just one kind of indication of what I mean by looking at interactivity, looking at sequences of forced migration and more primarily labor migration or family reunification across these different spaces of origin, transit, and destination. Within this kind of framework, I want to highlight a couple of different issues on the southern border, which will also be taken up, I think, by some of our fellow panelists today. So those two issues are the notion of border externalization, of the effort of powerful states to push their border control into the territories of other states or into international spaces like the high seas, as well as the notion of mixed flows. So on externalization, we see some novelty, but also a lot of precedent in terms of what's going on with the southern border of the U.S. and the attempt by the American government to use Mexico as a kind of buffer state between not just Central America, but increasingly people from really around the world, the so-called extracontinental migrants, the large subset of whom would be seeking asylum were they able to reach the U.S. There's a lot more continuity in that story than you would get from reading the newspapers. Going back into the early 1980s, we've seen the U.S. government applying all kinds of techniques, which are still applied today, such as, for example, pressuring the Mexican government to impose visa restrictions on, back in the 80s, we're talking about Salvadorans and Guatemalans, so that they could not simply fly to a northern Mexican border city like Tijuana and cross. The Mexican government, again, with a lot of pressure from the U.S. government, at that time would restrict potential asylum seekers to staying within the southern part of the country, away from Mexico's northern border with the U.S. The UNHCR, with funding from the U.S. primarily, funded refugee camps for Guatemalan primarily, but to a lesser extent for Salvadoran refugees in southern Mexico. There were policies of de facto accepting pushback from the U.S. to Mexico of asylum seekers who were never given the opportunity to file a case, as well as chain refoulement of people who were pushed back from the U.S. to Mexico and then from Mexico to their countries of origin, and many documented cases of people who were then killed by the security forces, for example. So there are a lot of similarities today, but not everything is the same. We see some new iterations, especially when it comes to the scale of the contemporary movements, as well as, probably more importantly, the diversification of the origin countries. But a lot of the mechanisms are similar. So let me just highlight one, which is that recently there's been a lot of attention in the press to the more or less 500,000 migrants who have crossed through the Darien Gap between Colombia and Panama. And there have always been people crossing through that difficult jungle terrain, but why has there been such a dramatic increase? Well, it's because Mexico has now imposed visa restrictions on Venezuelans and Ecuadorians who find it now much more difficult to simply fly to Mexico. So they are crossing by land. That's the vast majority of the people crossing through the gap right now are from those two countries. They're crossing by land, but now instead of flying safely, they're crossing in really dangerous conditions, given that space is more or less controlled by non-state actors, by criminal organizations. Something else that's new is that the U.S. has become the world's #1 asylum-seeking destination. That's actually quite unusual in recent years. And the vast majority of those folks are crossing the southwest border rather than applying for asylum once they're in the U.S. or reaching U.S. airports. The big change is that the composition of people who are apprehended by the U.S. Border Patrol, and importantly, a lot of people have actually presented themselves purposefully to the Border Patrol to ask for asylum. They're not necessarily entering clandestinely. But that composition has radically shifted so that now a flow that was completely dominated by Mexican nationals through most of the 20th century, even the early 21st century, somewhere between 98 and 90%, depending on the year that you're looking at, were Mexican nationals. Now, in the most recent statistics, only 28% are Mexican nationals. And for the first time, a majority of those who are apprehended at the border are not from Mexico or Central America. They're coming from further south in South America and other countries in the Caribbean, Haiti, Cuba, and around the world. So that is a major shift. Another major shift is that Mexico itself has become the world's 4th largest country of asylum seeking. But it's important to interpret that cautiously because most people in that situation, and we're talking about 76,000 in the first half of this year alone, most of those people are not in the first instance trying to stay in Mexico. Many will end up staying in Mexico. We don't know how many. but in a pattern that is consistent, somewhere, depending on the month, between half and 3/4 of those who apply for asylum in the U.S. abandon their applications. And there can be different reasons why people abandon their applications, but certainly historically one of the major reasons is that their ultimate destination really is the U.S., not Mexico. The U.S. continues to fund a lot of buffering activities in Mexico, and many of these buffering activities combine logics of both care and control, the way that refugee camps, for example, combine logics of both caring for refugees as well as controlling them and keeping them from moving, or changing the incentives so they're less likely to move. The UNHCR operations in Mexico, 3/4 of those of that money is coming from the U.S., earmarked for UNHCR operations in Mexico specifically. Another continuity, which is, I don't think, well recognized in media accounts, is that yes, Mexico is deporting large numbers of Central Americans in particular. When I say large, I'm talking about 41,000 deportations in the first 9 months of this year. But that's a continuity because since around 1989, there has been a campaign of mass deportation of primarily 3 Central American nationalities from Mexico, Guatemalans, Salvadorans, and Hondurans. And between 1989 and 2017, there were 3.5 million deportations of those 3 nationalities from Mexico. Those are events, so some of those might refer to the same person, but 3.5 million deportations during that period. Okay, the last issue that I want to mention is the one of mixed flows. Now, the notion of mixed flows has a couple of different ideas. It conflates 2 different ideas that we would want to pull apart. One is the idea that within a group of people who are moving at a particular time, you have people who are moving for different motivations. So people who might easily meet a refugee definition in the Refugee Convention definition, for example, and people who would not meet that definition at all, but who are, say, labor migrants, or they're moving exclusively or primarily for reasons of family reunification. And then there's a different notion of mixed, which is that often the same individual will have different reasons for moving that might include efforts to flee violence, as well as hoping to flee economic precarity, or the hope for a more dignified life. So there has been a lot of attention to the fact that there are more mixed flows, or this is the claim anyway, that there are more mixed flows now when it comes to people who are apprehended on the U.S.-Mexico border. As I've said, it's true that there's a diversification of origin countries, many more asylum seekers, a much greater share of families and children traveling without their parents. That is fairly novel. But migration from Latin America has always included people who move for mixed motivations. Even people who have been considered, at least colloquially, refugees, to take one of many examples, the more than 1 million Cuban nationals who have come to the U.S. and not as resettled refugees in the majority, but often referred to as refugees by policymakers. Very few of them, especially after the early 1960s, would be considered a classical dissident who might fit into the Refugee Convention definition. We can debate that, but I think I would stand by that argument. So there are a lot of mixed motivations and those kinds of flows, as well as flows from Central America. There's a huge body of research that shows how violence, whether it's from criminal gangs or from state actors or a wartime situation, generates all kinds of economic problems. It creates opportunities for extortion, for confiscation of goods, of property, of deteriorated markets that are difficult for both entrepreneurs as well as workers. And so these kind of dynamics really show the interaction of economic and political push factors. And to this day, this is a major reason why we see so many people leaving Central America today. But that is nothing new. And unfortunately, I think there's no real reason to believe that we would move away from a situation of mixed flows. I think that is inherent to what drives people to move. So I'll leave it at that and send it to my colleagues.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to this panel debate. And I have to say something about Europe, and it's actually always difficult to say something about Europe because, Europe, there are many different countries, and they have different experiences with immigration, and especially with refugees. It's very diverse, basically. And so currently we have the invasion of the Russia into Ukraine, and it led to a large number of refugees into Europe, and where the EU used for the first time the Temporary Protection Directive on the 1st March of 22. And this gives refugees from Ukraine a temporary right to accommodation, medical care, employment, and education in all EU member states. Though it's interpreted differently by different member states, basically. Just to give an example, I'm living in Sweden. Ukrainians have the right to employment and schooling for children, but have a very low daily payment and to some extent accommodation. In Norway, for example, just the neighboring country, basically the Ukrainian refugees are treated like if they were asylum seekers, and they go into language courses and hopefully also later on into better employment afterwards. So there are two different paths, just neighboring countries. On the other hand, Ukrainians are dispersed all over Europe, of course, to a large extent in Eastern Europe, so the neighboring countries of Ukraine. But now we have refugees in all smaller countries that we haven't had before. If we go back to for example, the period when we had the Syrian civil war, and we had a large inflow during the 14, 15, and 16, where most of the refugees landed in Germany, Sweden, Austria, Italy, the Netherlands, so a number of countries, and that's totally different in this case, this time. And it's actually that inflow in the middle of the last decade that has led to what we currently have at the EU level, the negotiations on the so-called new pact on migration and asylum. Now, this entails a number of things, and they're still negotiating, and there are some parts that are finished, but it's in the beginning of next year, so before the new elections, that they hopefully finalize this. And we have a new asylum and migration management regulation, which basically entails that they streamline procedures, mandatory solidarity for relocation, financial contributions to the countries that have going to have a larger number of refugees, also personal and capacity building at the borders primarily, and they talk about that 30,000 persons or people that will get asylum are then relocated. This is of course far too low, and that will also increase probably when it actually happens. And if you not take this as a member state to solidarity reasons, you can pay it off by 20,000 euros per person. I say this is still negotiating, but these are sort of the things that has been leaking out, you could say, and you can also read this on basically on the website. There's going to be a new EU asylum agency, the EUAA, and it's the idea behind this, of course, that refugees that when they come to the border, that they are actually also treated and that they can seek asylum at the border, and that they don't go further into Europe as they do normally do if they can. So there are going to be uniform rules on asylum applications, a common asylum procedure, which means that procedures are streamlined and with a certain set of rights to asylum applicants. The applicants can also be for maximum of 6 months. Illegal crossings are returned, and basically the idea is that if there is a less than 20% recognition rate to certain countries, basically you are returned. That's the whole idea with this. So new rules when crisis in asylum, just we had, for example, with Ukraine, and also earlier, there's going to be a new screening regulation, so pre-entry screening at the external borders on health and vulnerability, identity checks, registration of biometric data, and at the same time, so there's going to be a EU fingerprinting database and etc. It's going to basically to have a better control on the people that are seeking asylum. But at the same time, there's also discussions on a better reception of individuals. So not only at the border, but also later on when they are getting their final destination in different countries, basically. So there's also, with this, a new resettlement framework discussed and how this is going to be done. Of course, there is critical voices to this. There's going to be more use of the border procedure that will probably lead to more people in detention centers at the external borders. And there's going to be substandard asylum procedures and also be more pushbacks than expected. There almost no exemptions from the border procedures for vulnerable people like families and children, and it's going to be a eroded definition of the safe third country. So this is basically the negative sides of having this system. On the other hand, you can see this packed in different ways. The large inflow of 2015, different states wanted to move forward with a more sort of balanced approach to refugees in Europe and to improve security, but also, of course, legal certainty and redistribution of asylum seekers among the different EU member states. And you could say that it's the first time now that we are discussing this in Europe. So in that sense, it's a way, probably a way forward if you go back in time, how it looked in the middle of the last decade. But this is going to lead to harder and stricter border control, and maybe a better, or at least an improved asylum-seeking procedure in certain countries, but not in others, probably, because at the border they will be helped by other countries to do this, the EUAA, as I said, and but there is also going to be a lot of redistribution, but also pushbacks. So, given the current political situation, I would say in Europe, there's going to be more financial and political support that will be given to refugees close by, in this case refugees from Ukraine, and it's also shown in surveys. Basically, if we look at a number of countries where we've done these surveys and asked how are Ukrainians looked upon as refugees compared to the people that from outside Europe, then Ukrainians are seen as better integrating or more welcome, etc., compared to the people that come from outside Europe. So these are these differences. So it's politically it's more feasible that this is that Ukrainians are seen as more positive than people that coming from the outside Europe. There are going to be restrictive parts of the migration pact, so screening and database improvements, and there will also be returns, basically backed by the current political situation in Europe. So redistribution of asylum seekers and refugees between countries are going to be very limited. So there's so far little solidarity between the member states, and actually also very little solidarity with the rest of the world, with all the people that wanted to come to Europe. So, and there are several EU countries are willing to pay for keeping refugees outside the EU through agreements with countries hosting many refugees or labor migrants, as well as having waiting centers of asylum seekers outside Europe. And probably my next speaker will take this up. Other critical points are made that it's going to be a very complicated system, and it also will be a very slow implementation, and more people in detention. And finally, so there's going to be a lot of political discussion about refugees, but very little about labor migration. Europe needs labor demographically, but also economic changes make that we need more people. And a little discussion is about this, or at least at the EU level, maybe on country level, but not on the EU level. So, thank you.
Thank you. Over to you, Gracias.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much, Rina. Thank you, Jim and Woodrow Wilson, organizers, for putting this lovely event together, and all of you for showing up on a Wednesday afternoon to hear us talk about forced migration. So at Glasgow, I work on the politics of migrants, refugees, diasporas in the Middle East, primarily in the broader global South. And this is something that makes me particularly happy, given that I think there is an ongoing process of incorporating the global South a bit more into what we're doing in terms of both forced and labor migration, academically, theoretically, in terms of policy making, and so on and so forth. There is a lot of richness out there that would infuse and enhance our understanding of how refugee movements and politics operate. By spending some time, by talking to people outside the West, by speaking different languages, by spending time there, understanding the culture, and actually experiencing actors, processes, and outcomes on a first-hand basis. Is this better? I hope it is. Essentially, it's a normative argument, but it's also a substantive one, given that one of the things that is often not mentioned in terms of labor and forced migration is how much more common forced migration flows are in the global South than in the global North. So if you look at numbers, you'll see that people are much more likely to be forced migrants going from one part of the global South to another than coming from the global South to Europe and North America. So the South-South dimension is central here, and it's something that we frequently overlook in our attempt to make a more European-centered argument. And I think this is a process that has been ongoing in terms of the, I guess, decolonizing forced migration studies as well. So if we were to shift the attention to the global South a bit, I think we can come across two paradoxes that my previous speakers, that my colleagues haven't really identified perhaps, and it's worth spending a couple of minutes on. The first, I would call paradox, is the fact that refugee hosting states across the global South, the countries that host the most number of forcibly displaced migrants, are not actually those responsible for creating this refugee crisis to begin with. So if you look, for instance, at the Syrian refugee crisis, the fact that millions of people are hosted in Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon is quite curious, given the fact that these three states had nothing to do with the outbreak of the Syrian civil war. And yet they opened up their borders and took in these people quite generously. And this, I think, particularly if you compare it to the unwillingness of global northern countries to do the same, makes things quite interesting for us analytically. And perhaps even more interesting if we're trying to essentially go back in time, historicize the origins of this refugee crisis, and see that a lot of the times the countries responsible for them lie outside the global South and more closer to us than the other way around. The second paradox, I would say, would have to do with this disjuncture between what the global North is doing and what the global South is doing. And the global South, I should say, is an interesting term. It has a lot of supporters and a lot of opponents. One of the and valid arguments on both sides, and one of the points that has been frequently raised has to do with the fact that, well, we're using a term that's trying to bring together over 100 countries, I suppose, in a single kind of thing, and homogenize things a bit too much. But I think, and that's a perfectly valid point, but if you look at it from a refugee studies perspective, one of the very interesting things that perhaps flies across regions, at least the Middle East, but also throughout the so-called global South, has to do with the fact that most of these countries are economically struggle, let's say, to take these people in. In other words, a common component across most of the refugee hosting states of the global South is that they open up their borders and they house refugees, they feed them, they try to incorporate them somehow, they try to give them access to the labor market formally or informally. They do things even though that comes at a sharp detriment to their economic well-being. And I think the thing that makes it even more humbling is if you compare this to the attitudes of states in Europe and North America, of states that have GDPs that are multiple times the size of states such as Lebanon, and yet are unwilling to take a portion of the people that Lebanon currently hosts. So that puts things a bit in perspective, I think, and it's important to keep this in the back of our minds. The way I try to deal with all these tensions in my work is to look at the international relations aspect of this, so the diplomatic aspect of how this all plays out in world politics, right? What we've been using as an analytical concept is the concept of migration diplomacy that looks essentially at how waves of forced migration might lead to diplomatic outcomes. One example being, for instance, the EU-Turkey statement or the EU-Turkey deal of 2016, where you have these massive refugee outflows that pave the way for these negotiations that happen on a multilateral side between Turkey and the European Union. The other way around, of course, is how migration also, how diplomacy creates migration. And this is something that comes up quite frequently. One obvious example, for instance, would be what's happened a couple of years ago in Eastern Europe, where Belarus, under Lukashenko, essentially, as a result of a number of foreign policy debacles with Europe, decided to try to create a mini refugee crisis himself. Right? So this is the inverse relationship in which a refugee crisis gets created from an existing diplomatic spat. And you see how that operates there. So a lot of us in both sides of the Atlantic and in the global south have been trying to understand these processes. So look at the actors, highlight the geopolitical component, the neo-realist component, if you want. How is it used? How is migration diplomacy used? How are refugees essentially reduced to instrumentalized actors in these kinds of geopolitical debates and games? And how perhaps the global north even starts doing something very similar. If you look at specific countries in Europe, you'll see, or if you look at the previous president even perhaps in this country, you'll see that us in the West are quite willing to also play these games and use migrants and refugees quite instrumentally. So all of this has been said, and I'm happy to discuss this further in the Q&A. One thing I was thinking about to add, and that's my final point, in terms of things that haven't been said perhaps, is a paper I presented at California a couple of days ago, I suppose a week ago, that looks at a crisis, a refugee crisis that happened at the Greek-Turkish border, not in 2015 or 2016, as most of us know, but in 2020, where Erdogan essentially encouraged a few thousand desperate people to make their way to the land border separating Greece and Turkey and try to force their way into European territory, right? And what's interesting here, there's a lot of things interesting in that, what happened in those few weeks of February and March 2020, right before the COVID outbreak, essentially. And we can talk about the geopolitics of this, but what's particularly fascinating to me is how we responded as Europeans. So Brussels perceived of this as yet another attempt by a poor country in the global south to essentially blackmail the liberal West into submission, and actually informally offered quite a bit of money to Erdogan to make this problem go away. So there was diplomatic back channels between Brussels and Ankara, with Brussels offering money to Erdogan in exchange for essentially stopping these refugee flows, much like what had happened in 2015, 2016. And the fascinating thing for me as an IR scholar is that Erdogan turned them down. And he said, well, this is not about money. It's about something else, right? And us as international relations scholars, we don't really know what this something else is, right? So we always look at these crises in terms of numbers, in terms of the political economy or the material aspect. But I think what's the next step here, and I'm happy to hear your ideas, is we need to talk about issues of dignity, issues of solidarity, issues of sharing the cost, or something else that we can't understand by looking at London or Paris or DC. We have to decenter the gaze a bit and look at Ankara look at Delhi, that Kamal will probably talk about, look at the Middle East, Africa, try to understand things from the other perspective, and perhaps that way we can enact some meaningful change. So perhaps I really wanted to end on a positive note, which is really difficult in such a context, but I think trying to look at refugee studies from a global south perspective might allow us to highlight these issues of injustice in world politics, these questions of dignity, and start putting them at the forefront, right? And try to see if there's something that can be amended there, and hopefully make things a bit better. So I'll stop there, Rina, if that's okay.
Thank you. Come on.
Thank you, Rina. I'll begin with John Adams, who famously argued 2.5 centuries ago that facts are stubborn things. So while majority of the signatories to the 1951 Refugee Convention are located in the global north, the fact remains that the overwhelming majority of the world's refugees are located in states in the global south, many of whom are non-signatories to the Refugee Convention. So we'll start with that fact. I won't bore you with numbers, but I just want to point out 3-4 things. One, the refugee regime is broken. States are looking at alternative regimes, treaties, and they're sometimes going in for bilateral memorandums of understanding in some ways. Or they're looking at regional norms to solve, to address the refugee issues. What do I mean by the fact that the refugee regime is broken? Well, there is a cumulative and increasing delegitimization of the refugee regime. And why is it happening? Because there is policy uncertainty. Why is there policy uncertainty? There is added pressure on weak states, low-capacity states that are receiving majority of the refugees. And yet the allocations are not coming through. So what do you have? Bangladesh gets about 60% of the funding that it requires to carry out its activities, right? So they have 930,000 refugees in Cox's Bazar, and they're getting about a small percentage of the funds they need as of 1 June 2023. What does this mean? This means the refugees are getting only a minimum recommended 2,100 kcal consumption level. Their consumption levels are below minimum standards, which will then have a cumulative impact on the household food security, which will then increase the malnutrition rates in these refugee camps. So the current UNHCR estimates are that needs outweigh funds. Bangladesh gets 275 million to meet its mandate, but only has 110 million. Uganda needs 343 million, but the actual budget is 888 million. What does this mean? It creates a policy uncertainty. How is the refugee regime working for them then, right? Let me go to a specific, another source of policy uncertainty. Since the refugee regime is not adequate, they have to rely on a broad range of humanitarian regimes. ICRC is one, Doctors Without Borders, Mercy in Malaysia, etc., are playing a role to serve these citizens. So how do these separate humanitarian actors disperse funds? Let me give you an example. There's an IGO that is dispersing funds on sanitation, had an expertise on sanitation in Bangladesh. Their funds ran out after, 3-5 months. So they started talking to another agency. That agency had funds, but not the expertise to handle sanitation. And they think somebody's got to take over because this agency's funds have run out. They can't do sanitation For 930,000 people, sanitation is important. But the agency that's being asked to take over, humanitarian agency, not a refugee agency, to take over sanitation, has funds but no expertise. They don't do sanitation. So what's happening? Sometimes agencies jump in that have funds but have no expertise. And they are doing humanitarian services. Some agencies have short-term funding cycles. What are you going to get out of this? You're going to get short-term services being provided to enhance refugee rights. There is no consistent tackling of food, sanitation, housing, roofing, whatever you want to. So the question is, if with this policy uncertainty, are you going to get congruence? Do you have congruence between the refugee regime and the humanitarian actors that are playing a role? Which means there is a delegitimization of the refugee regime. States have to create, Bangladesh has created an Inter-Sector Coordination Group, ISCG, as a central coordinating body because it's realized UNHCR can't do it, but there are many other humanitarian actors that are involved. Okay, so that's just one. Funding cycles is another. Let me go to another issue. Now, because these are non-signatory states to the convention, we run into the issue of what non-state agencies, private companies, are active amongst the refugees to provide protection. Are there legal agreements, legal relationships that will undergird any unofficial refugee regime provisions in non-signatory states? So what I'm trying to say is that if there are violations, some agency is providing food, tarp, tiles, all kinds of services, who will be accountable if they violate this thing? Who do they go to if there's no signatory to the international refugee regime? Who will be accountable? Will there be fines, compensation, imprisonment? Can international refugee convention, regime, or international law be invoked to calculate the legal liability, or will this only rely on domestic law? These companies are providing tarp, zinc sheets, cement for walls, flower pots for small nurseries and huge camps, medicines, doctors, rice, vegetables, water, sanitation, and waste disposal. So can International Refugee Convention and Regime and their institutions, UNHCR, legally and institutionally recognize and coordinate with non-state actors and private companies such that refugees are protected under international conditions, treaties, and laws besides domestic law, which is not always functioning in many of the southern states? That's another issue. Now, let me take you to a problem, another problem. We now have an international regime that doesn't want to disperse stipends but wants to move to self-reliance. That's the new slogan. Only 75 of the 145 signatory states, however, grant the right to work without reservations. So 55% of the world's refugees have restrictions on their right to work. And as you know, if they're getting $8 or less per month, how are they going to survive? They'll have to informally find a job. If they are going to find, and if they're going to live in these states from between 5 to 20 years, then we have a problem. They'll be working illegally in violation of domestic law. So you don't give enough stipends to them. They work illegally. That's in violation of the local laws. And de facto, you're pushing this population into illegality by forcing them to work. So who protects them if they have wage abuse, if they have physical abuse, when they work as domestic workers, house cleaners, maids, drivers, what happens if their job is terminated in the informal economy? Do they get some salary compensation? What if domestic law is corrupt or biased against them? Do they have recourse to any legal protection under international refugee law and regime? All right. So that's one issue, another issue. Let me go to the last issue, which I'm sort of a little more familiar with. Documents. That's where actually I've done most of my work. So you know that the UNHCR has a card. Sometimes you get a refugee camp ID. But a variety of other IDs are required when they start working informally in southern states. They need maybe a car license, informally acquired. They need a hospital ID, maybe, to go to the hospital for births, for major injuries. They might need a primary high school or a high school ID to get their kids into school illegally, informally. Birth certificates, if they're born there, will they get it? Marriage certificate, if they marry locally, right? Company employment papers, work IDs, temporary work authorizations, province or state IDs, travel permissions, and authorizations. Are they de jure documents if they acquire them informally, or are they de facto documents? What kind of documentation is it? When they apply for asylum, are they relying on a whole range of documents that they got in the transit state that were illegally acquired? How is Canada or a state in Europe going to adjudicate that if they have lived for 20 years in a transit state? I've met in San Diego somebody who came from Afghanistan as a refugee but lived for 10, 15 years in Delhi. His kids went to school. He went to the hospital. He has it. How are you going to adjudicate? As I see it, he's as much Afghan as he could have been an Indian because he had all these other documentation to prove. And here we are creating these fingerprints thinking they're coming from the sending state. They might not have any document. They might have acquired those documents in the transit state. How are you going to distinguish this problem of adjudication between fake and real documents, even in the refugee system? So I think we have to think about this. This policy uncertainty that is going through the entire system is getting delegitimated. Now, I want to point to you something that I think we should start thinking about. All this policy uncertainty then gets to resentment in several non-signatory states, which leads to a securitization of refugees. We want to kick them out. We want to deport them if we can, etc. So the fundamental thing that we should ask ourselves is, we've always thought of power and national security as being linked to migration. They bring skills or they work in our agriculture. Should we be linking power and national security to refugee systems as well? And in what way? Second, demography is destiny, somebody said. If most of Europe and East Asia is aging, and majority of the younger population, including skilled, lie in parts of Africa, Asia, or elsewhere, and isn't it time that the aging countries, I don't want to use South-North here, the aging countries, for their own interest, develop a higher, more sophisticated understanding of where this labor, not just migration, refugees included, will come from. Till we move to that stage, refugee regime and its institutions are going to move towards de-legitimation. And I think it's a huge problem that's being postponed by the very countries that needs younger people, whether refugees or migration. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamal. So next I want to invite Professor Jim Hollifield back up to give some discussion comments.
Yes, well, I know we're going to run short on time, so I'm just going to make a few remarks to highlight some of the things that came out in the panel. Hopefully, they will be provocative and stimulate a little more discussion from the panel. And of course, we're very eager to hear from all of you out there who are listening online. I think we're going to moderate the questions, so hopefully we can get to as many questions as possible. Going back to where David Fitzgerald started the remarks, I just wanted to say, open with a little short anecdote. I worked ever so briefly at UNHCR. It was about 1991, if you recall. That was a critical year in Europe. Madame Ogata, Sadako Ogata, was the UN High Commissioner, and my boss was a guy named Sergio Vera de Mello. Some of you may remember him, who probably would have been Secretary General of the UN had he lived to make it. He was killed in the bombing of the UN headquarters in Baghdad at the beginning of the American occupation of Iraq, along with Arthur Helton, who was the great refugee scholar at the Council on Foreign Relations. And Gil Loescher survived. He was the professor at Oxford who lost his legs and an arm but survived the attack. So there's a lot of people who put their lives on the line, if you will, in trying to deal with these issues. But when I arrived at UNHCR, this will be good to sort of launch the discussion, I was a young, ambitious, academic and wanted to come in and make my mark. So one of the first things I said was, what about these silos? And this idea that we have to always distinguish the motives from political, from economic migrants. And I said, we really need to open that up and discuss that here at UNHCR. Well, needless to say, my career at UNHCR was very short. And I had all the lawyers in the building were assigned to follow me around everywhere I went to make sure that I didn't say this again. Because if we try to get out of those silos, David, we risk undermining the entire refugee system. So if we can't distinguish legally, those people who have a legitimate claim to be refugees from those who are moving for economic or other reasons, then the global refugee system is not going to work. It will collapse. So this is the raison d'être, to use a good French term, of the global refugee system. So I learned my lesson the hard way at the beginning here. But I do want to just highlight a couple of other things. I really want to stress the importance of David's new book, understanding these as systems, migratory refugee systems. None of this has started yesterday. It did not start in a vacuum. There are great, what I call migration interdependence, mutually dependent societies, populations. And a lot of this has to do with imperial and colonial history. One of my favorite expressions when you ask someone who has fled or someone who has migrated from a former colony to a former imperial power, they often say, "We are here because you were there." So we have to understand how these networks work. And when I think about migration and the motives for why people move, I tend to focus on 4 different factors, and I would love to hear what my colleagues say about this. I often say we can probably understand why people move just in terms of a basic microeconomic dynamic. Many people move because of demand pull factors, supply push factors, and that may explain 70, 80% of the movements in the world at any given point in time. And we know that those movements would not be possible, this is something the sociologists and anthropologists have taught us, without the extensive networks, the family connections. That's what, to use an economic term, that's what lowers the transaction costs for moving. It lowers the risks and the uncertainty in making the move if you have someone there. But here's my punchline, and if I've made a contribution to this field, I think it's because I brought our attention very much back to rights and the rights dynamic. And just for the audience and everyone here for the discussion, this is something still relatively new in world politics and world history. It came really after World War II with the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the Refugee Convention itself, 1950, and the 1967 Protocol. Don't forget, the Refugee Convention only applied to Europe in its initial inception. It was designed to help refugees in Europe. So we should always pay attention, I think, to the rights dynamic here. I'm at the risk of going straight to my conclusion and punchline. I mean, the U.S. was a leader in this throughout much of the post-war era. This humanitarian system could not function without the strong international human rights dynamic. And we all know that if you're going to build some kind of global regime, you've got to have a leader, you've got to have powerful states who get behind this. So without that U.S. leadership, it's going to be very, very difficult, I think, for this system to survive. We've got to understand why it is in the U.S. national interest to come back as a leader in humanitarian policy. A couple of other things before I stop. We certainly have seen an increase in forced migration and displacement. David mentioned the mixed flows. You know, this is a much more fluid system. He pointed out that countries that were once great sending countries have now become transit countries and even countries of destination. You know, I've written about this in the context of Mexico, Turkey being another good example, Morocco, a country where I've spent a great deal of time. And to come back to Europe and Peter Beverlander's point, you know, I was in Europe living and working in Paris at the French Institute for Advanced Study when the war in Ukraine started, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And the first thing that occurred to me, of course, now the shoe is on the other foot, or perhaps back on the European foot. The Europeans had never seen anything like this really since the immediate post-war years with the beginning of the Cold War and the sorting of populations that occurred during that period. And it was a shock, I think, to the Europeans and the European system. Now we're talking about Ukrainians, and of course we know that the Ukrainians were treated much better, much differently than those coming from Africa, the Middle East, or South Asia, and we can get into a discussion about why that was the case. But just a couple of things to conclude and ask a couple of more questions for my colleagues here. If there's one or two punchlines that I want to get across, the lesson that we should have learned in recent years and decades, it's not possible to deal with these humanitarian crises unilaterally. We have to have, hopefully, international cooperation, the UN Compact for Migration and Refugees, which was put forward only a few years ago. It's still advisory. It's not taken the form of a treaty. It's not been implemented. But we can't manage this without international cooperation. And I would argue, maybe this is somewhat controversial, the regional cooperation is so critical because you have to be able to deal with your neighbors, to help your neighbors. And, you know, one of the articles I wrote here at the Wilson Center, I said, if my neighbor's house is on fire, but that's not my problem. You know, I don't need to get in the fire brigade or help out with this. And that is a recipe for disaster. And trying to deal with this unilaterally, the U.S. learned, I think, the hard way over several administrations that you simply cannot deal with these issues on a unilateral basis. So, you know, building a wall is not going to resolve these crises. The need for solidarity and the need for burden sharing or responsibility sharing. I think we have all heard that term. It's very interesting to look at how this happens from one region to another. Professor Sadiq, you know, talked about the problems that Bangladeshis have faced, for example. Everybody in this room and in the audience has heard about what's going on with Texas and Florida, busing migrants to different parts of the world, the crisis that we saw in New York City. I'm sure we could get into that. Who is responsible for this? As difficult as things are in Europe, Peter, at least the Europeans have, a regional dynamic. They're trying to get a regional policy, and it certainly is not perfect, but we're going to have to see more of this kind of regional cooperation. So I would stress that. So I think in the interest of time, I will probably stop there. I think I've raised enough questions, and we want to take the questions from the audience. I think our colleague Joshua Peng is working on managing that. So Joshua and colleagues, shall we move now to questions from the audience? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to say two quick things that follow from you, Jim, because when you say getting rid of silos risks dismantling the refugee system, I can't help but to think Kamal told us the refugee system is broken. So rather than dismantling it, I just wonder if we could expand it to include migrant labor, rather than trying to pursue two separate systems. As David told us, individuals have mixed reasons for moving. They don't always just have one. As both Peter and Gerasimos mentioned, host countries in the EU as well as host countries in the global south desperately need labor. But yet, as we learned from Kamal, 55% of states that host refugees forbid them from working. So I'm just curious to put out there to the speakers, but also to the audience, could we envision a new system, not one that's dismantled, but one that's expanded to include refugees and migrant labor? Would that make sense? Is it feasible? And then the other quick question I wanted to raise following you is you said you can't deal with this unilaterally. And one thing that struck me in all of your talks was this issue of equitable responsibility that keeps cropping up. And as David, you mentioned, powerful states are just sort of pushing off some of the responsibility to poorer states. The EU is, even within the EU, is trying desperately to redistribute responsibility, but it's not very easy, even when you have a structure like the EU among wealthy countries. That story you mentioned, Gerasimos, by Erdogan is really moving, that, it's not about just responsibility on cost. It's also just in principle, sort of this notice of dignity and sharing the responsibility. And then finally, Kamal, you raised this sort of almost promise that if we don't turn to an more equitable sharing of this, what we're going to find is this criminalization or securitization of refugees, really separating the refugees even more from the native population. So again, I guess my question is, what are pathways to getting this equitable responsibility, if we can't even do it within regions, let alone across the world? So with that, I'll turn it over to questions, maybe starting with the audience, and then also over to Zoom. Yes, if you could just introduce yourself first, and then please proceed.
Thank you. This was terrific. Thank you to all the panel. Very informative. I wanted to ask you a little bit about repatriations and deportations. At the moment in Germany, which is what I've been studying, there's an effort afoot to increase the number of asylum seekers whose applications have been denied. And they're currently in a sort of a limbo status of being tolerated. And there have been efforts now to step up. You may have heard that the coalition is pushing to step up deportations to actually carry them out. On the ground, it's very difficult, though, to repatriate people when they don't have papers. And this brings me to your point, Kamal, about lack of documentation. These are all interrelated problems, and they're not just in the global south, they're also in the global north. It becomes impossible to work if you're in a tolerated status. And of course, this leads to disorder in European cities as well. So, yeah, I wanted to ask you about what does one do if one relies on repatriation as a policy, and how much more international cooperation is needed?
Do you want to start?
Well, I can begin. I don't think I have solutions. Certainly, coordination between, let's say, ICAO and standard guidelines between states, between North and South states, between Europe, United States, and ICAO on airlines and perhaps shipping lanes, etc., on standardization of documents helps. But I think, so here's the dilemma. You identify a small percentage of the refugees for deportation, and then you bear the cost of their travel back to wherever you have identified as the source country. Sometimes it might send them to a transit country, not to their source country, which happens. But what is the percentage that you are repatriating or deporting? Cumulatively, right? Is it 5%? Is it 10%? Is that threshold success? Is it possible that some of them will try again, this time as migrants, under new identities, right? With new countries, they might end up. What are we here talking about in our expectation of deportations over long distances, not neighboring countries? So we are assuming that deportation and repatriation of a very small percentage of people will be successful, and instead of, let's say, Germany bearing the burden, some percentage of it comes back but is now in Italy. Right now they've seen Europe and they would like to go back to Europe. So I'm wondering whether this system will work, one. Number two, it requires a whole range of coordination of documentation, where we are not sure. So the refugee goes back and wants to give it another try as an economic migrant, maybe, right? And so we're getting into a circular process in trying to defend the nation state from a problematic claim. A claim that we can't distinguish. In one cycle we distinguish when we deported, then there could be another cycle. Or, actually, better still, the refugee who goes back starts a manpower agency because he has information, and then he sends other potential refugees, which is happening. He becomes the node in destination, and he provides the information for others to go. How are we going to have permanent solution to this mobility? Now, I'm not sure that we can collapse the refugee regime and the migration regime. But I'm saying that the refugee regime itself is missing out all the other displacements, other forced migration itself. It doesn't cover all the forced migrations, IDPs who have not made it, several other categories of forced migrations. So documentation itself will have, and biometric, fingerprinting, all of that will require, Europe and the United States are not on the same page in some of these things, on coordination on biometric measures. So forget about doing it with South countries. So
Maybe we'll turn it over because there's some questions coming in online as well, and we can collect a few.
So I'll just read them off. The three we have here. So I'll read them all off, and then we can take them all together. One from Senge Sering asking, Pakistan has driven out over 1 million refugees, which seems to be done to punish the decision of the Afghan Taliban government to support and protect the Pakistani Taliban. Iran has also announced that they will expel Afghan refugees. What should the U.S. do to manage this crisis? Claude Butner asks, what does the inevitable collapse of the refugee system look like? Would there be some workable plan to address need, not legal status? And Dr. Valerie F. Hunt from the President Center for Equitable Policy in a Changing World asks, the new system expanding to include refugees and migrants must be done in a regional manner. How would we be able to approach this in a U.S., Mexico, Canada, in light of current indigenous issues about land sovereignty?
Okay, thank you. Maybe David, do you want to start us off with the last question?
Sure. So, I'm less clear about the indigenous aspect of that question. But in terms of thinking of regional responses of U.S., Mexico, Canada, I'm in favor of regional kinds of compacts, but I don't like those that are exclusively restrictive. And so much of the regional cooperation has been about trying to make it all but impossible for people who would have a legitimate case to present, if they were allowed to travel to make that case, from ever being able to do so. So I don't like cooperation for the sake of cooperation, but there are examples of cooperative regional arrangements that I think have led to really good things, such as the Cartagena arrangements from 1984, which was instigated by the UNHCR. It was a non-binding agreement that expanded the definition of forced migrants to include people who were fleeing situations of generalized disorder and not the much narrower 5 grounds in the UN Refugee Convention of 1951. Even though it was not binding, eventually that law came into the domestic law of 14 countries in Latin America. So I think that's a good example of a regional process that yielded something very useful. It took a long time. In 1985, maybe it would have looked like it wasn't really that important, but over the long haul, that turned out to be important. We don't know many details about the newer proposals to establish processing centers in Guatemala and Colombia and Costa Rica for asylum seekers to apply as third country nationals in those places and then travel safely to the U.S. if their claims are recognized. In principle, if that's not just done as a way to legitimate much harsher measures, if that becomes a serious pathway, a kind of humanitarian corridor, as we've seen very small examples of in the Italian case, for example, then that's a great example of regional cooperation. So, the devil's in the details there right now. The Canadian piece is important because most Canadian policy is enabled by the fact that it has this 800-pound gorilla of the U.S. as a buffer state. We often talk about the U.S. as the destination state, which it always has been, but it's also very important in that regional system, primarily as a buffer between Canada and the rest of the world.
Anyone else want to take?
I can say briefly on the Pakistan case, if I may. I'm not an expert on Pakistan by any means, but what essentially we are seeing across much of the world is essentially this process of diffusion of these types of coercive migration diplomacy strategies, in which essentially states engage in issue leakage, right? So this would be the Alexander Betts and others' argument, where essentially bilateral relations, migrants and refugees get implicated in these bilateral relations. So I'm not sure what the U.S. could do, particularly given that the U.S. has also been accused of engaging in similar practices in the past. One way forward would be what the European Union did after Belarus tried to create this mini refugee crisis at the border, which is essentially legally argue that there needs to be more sanctions for using human beings as instruments of coercion, essentially. So that is one way forward. So go through the sanctions process, which of course a lot of scholars and academics would say, well, there's only so much you can do through that. But that would be one attempt to do this. But I would say Pakistan is by no means alone in terms of this, and this is something that we see over and over. And very briefly, if I may, on the repatriation question, because I look at it in the Middle East, we look at it in terms of how Jordan and Lebanon are becoming co-opted to engage in repatriation strategies. And I think it's terribly, terribly complex. Adding to Kamal just to add the foreign policy dimension of this. in terms of what Syria wants, because repatriation into Syria would involve normalization of the ties with the Syrian regime, right? In terms of what Hezbollah and other non-state actors want, and in terms of what Russia wants as well. So you have this explosive mix beyond kind of papers, logistics, all these domestic politics aspects. You have the foreign policy dimension, which I think creates it, makes it even more unmanageable. So I'm really curious to hear on the Germany case afterwards, if you don't mind.
Let me also say something about this with deportation, repatriation. I mean, Sweden is sort of in the same situation. They also, and the interesting thing is, I just read in the newspaper that, for example, that now we can repatriate people to Iraq, for example, which we couldn't. And I think that, and it has to be with bilateral relations and agreements, of course. That it become more problematic if people have committed crimes, for example, and they are not allowed to stay or even getting citizenship and stay in countries so there it's becoming a more of a problem, of course, and also to repatriate those persons, I think, and that's also happening.
I'm not an expert on Pakistan, but I work mainly on India and Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Indonesia. But let me say this. Perhaps Pakistan is using it as a signaling tool. And so threatening to deport, but not keeping large sections of that population of Afghans out of that threat. There are many populations that are not eligible for this deportation. It's only, they're saying 1.7 million. Well, what's the larger population of Afghan origins that's in Pakistan? But why is it doing it? Why are weak states incentivized to use it? Is it to catch United States attention for more funding? Is it to get European Union to pony up more money for this? And what is Iran's incentive to do this? And I think if we do not understand the geostrategic implications of this, both signaling and material payoffs, then we won't understand the full this deportation threat as an issue. Regarding another point about needs, right? I just want to point out something that I think as the refugee regime moves towards self-reliance. So let's explore the scenario. So refugee protection involves self-reliance, which requires employment rights, which most transit states do not provide. What's going to happen? Slowly, refugee system will push these refugees into poverty. This will then become a push factor for them for further migration. Right? If we can't survive here, we'll go somewhere else. Right? So that means refugees who are getting minimal stipend are incentivized to jump from state to state due to lack of economic opportunity and security. This means they are all going to undertake further journeys where there will be violence and exploitation and persecution during transit. Now they are refugees because of the violence in transit states, so they are transit refugees. Therefore, persecution during transit will become an increasing and rising phenomena on which to perhaps make a claim on a state. And that means the traditional standard refugee regime will further get delegitimized. And why am I saying this? Because jump from one state to another, an incentive to jump, is only going to increase with the use of cell phones and WhatsApp and information on how to get to other states. I'm trying to emphasize this south-north or north-south won't work. It might become circular. And if it becomes circular, then our regime, which talks about persecution from the sending state, will fall apart if the persecution or violence is happening in the transit state. So we have to really think about this. I think we might need either a rehauling of the system of conventions and organizations or addition of. where the need is central.
And I'll add to the point of circularity, the other thing that's also happening is this use of temporality, which, Peter, you raised in EU, using that as a force with which states are making sure refugees don't stay and migrants don't stay. They have to be temporary, and therefore, by definition, circularity. So I think our time is up. Thank you so much to those of you who joined us on Zoom and those of you who have come in person, and really sincere thanks to our speakers. It was very fascinating.
Yes, I just again want to thank the Wilson Center for hosting this event, my colleague John Thon, who couldn't be with us today, Joshua Peng, and Isabel Steiner, who's here somewhere, who staffed this, and all of you who came in person. And check out the RAFDI program, the RAFDI website. I think you'll find lots of interesting things there. And of course, all the scholarship of my colleagues here, which is waiting for you at your local library. So please run out and buy the books. So again, thank you very much. And I guess on that we will have to close the program. Thank you.
Thank you.